I'd like to introduce David Bateman. He is a writer, a poet, a performance artist, a critical thinker, and he's joining us here today in our Dean's Cafe. My name is Ashok Mathur. I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies, and I welcome all you here today. The book, Dr. Sad, is a novel. It's David's first novel. It is there behind me. And it was written in part in a context around some of the work he was doing while he was teaching as a creative writing instructor in Kamloops, in BC. But it's much more complex and complicated than that, as he'll inform you. So I'm going to turn it over now to David Bateman for a bit of a reading from Dr. Sad.
Thanks, Ashok. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I've only done a couple of readings so far. The book's only been out since the middle of November, but I'm never sure what to read. Ashok has asked me to read for about 10 to 15 minutes. So today, I haven't done this before. I'm going to start with the last chapter. It's a fairly short chapter. The book ends with a long poem. The book is a combination of poetry, some of it written for the book, some of it from various collections of mine in the past, over the past 20 years, that have been published by Frontenac House Press in Calgary. And the book ends with a very long poem called My Vancouver. And it's kind of an epilogue, but I call the epilogue the prologue. I have two prologues, one at the beginning and one at the end. So that some people might think it's a typo, but no, I don't know. Everything's a prologue to whatever happens next, right? Which is a very simplistic way of making an excuse for that double prologue. Anyway, My Vancouver, I'm not going to read the final poem, but it's kind of risky to end the book with a long poem. I'm going to just end it with the prose section before the poem, because it does talk about what I was just talking about, some of the Indigenous names that I use. Many of the chapters are titled either Tkaronto or Tk'emlúps. And so this is the final chapter of the book, My Vancouver. While living in Tk'emlúps, Stephen drove to Vancouver with his roommate a couple of times and became acquainted with all of the Shakespearean place names along the way. The Coquihalla was littered with sites that honored the work of an iconic bard. Romeo and Shylock appeared along the route from Summit to Hope. Stephen found the Portia interchange and Othello Road oddly intriguing. At one point, CP Rail sported the Othello tunnels. Poor absent Desdemona. Each station along the train route was named by avid Shakespearean readers in charge of the stolen land. Lear, Portia, Iago, Romeo, and Juliet all clung to an earth ravaged by transport and technology. Alas, the history of language. What a fucking colonizing mess. Just don't plan a leisurely picnic in Macbeth Valley, a peaceful stroll along trails of Coriolanus Canyon, or a joyful family reunion at Hamlet Hideaway or Pericles Parquet. Somewhere history, the annals of recorded doom, floats in an etherizing glow of time and space between sea and shining sea, coast to coast, rimmed by the Pacific, in lotus blossom land, across oceans and time zones, through the lives of intersecting humans. Stephen, a few summers after leaving Tk'emlúps and returning to Tkaronto, found himself on a working holiday painting a 3.5-story condo overlooking False Creek. False Creek was one of his favorite place names in all of Canada because it didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, false. Granville Island wasn't an island, not since the 1950s, but attached to land by an obtrusive, non-idyllic passageway encumbered by overhead slabs of concrete for traffic to scuttle across. Stephen thought of Vancouver as a precarious city. Beautiful and precarious, welcoming and forbidding, with weather that sent Stephen into an SAD mode for a prolonged period. He taught there at the school named after a Canadian painter who appropriated totems in their natural habitat. It happened before his Kamloops sojourn. He thought it might be a nice place to live as a permanently impermanent tourist, with a job enabling him to leave for sunny environs whenever the lack of light and the constant drizzle became too much to bear. Las Vegas, Mexico, Hawaii, just a stone's throw away. A flat, polished stone, skipping across puddles and continents like nobody's business but its own. But Vancouver, yes, such a beautiful city. It suited Stephen's sadness to a T, a form of sadness he had cultivated into melancholy over a lifetime. But that's another story. This story is about a diagnosis and the intersecting relationship at its heart. So I'll just skip to the final part of that chapter when he's crossing the Coquihalla, but just before the poem. But on that sunny, sunny day, in late summer, he looked forward to the drive through the mountains along the Coquihalla in a rented car. It always made him smile when he noticed the places named after Shakespearean characters. On his trek, he did something he had always dreamed of doing. He stopped at Coquihalla Canyon Provincial Park and made his way to the Othello tunnels. But Ophelia was Stephen's favorite. Her watery death appealed to Stephen's overwrought sense of aquatic narrative device, borrowed, artistically tailored and appropriated from earlier European stories, Italian, Spanish. These Shakespearean creatures were a group of romantic misfits finding love in, yes, all the wrong places. Hamlet, Ophelia, Romeo, Juliet, Othello, Desdemona. Stephen stood there overlooking rushing water. He began to jot notes for a long poem. And when he got to Banff, where he was meeting an old friend, lover, the saga always continues, he put Buffy St. Marie's later drumbeat version of Indian Cowboy on his laptop, went online and appropriated, paraphrased, parodied some Shakespearean verse to scatter like literary ashes throughout the corpus of his newest creation, filled with fact and fiction, flight and fancy, truth and lies. He could never tell the whole truth because he knew that he would get it all wrong. And that's basically how the prose section of the final chapter, the prologue, epilogue, ends just before the long poem. But if you buy the book, it's available as an ebook as well as an actual book or hard copy. Then you can read that whole poem. So I'll also read one more section because it represents how I use poetry. The Kamloops narrative is set mostly within a creative writing poetry class with different sojourns into various other sites, but it's often a what one early editor called it a campus novel. So it is kind of a campus novel. And very early in the book, there's an example of the poetry, and the opening kind of epigraph at this is a poem that I actually wrote when I was in high school. They gave us the first 2 lines of a limerick and we had to finish it. And the poem went like this: the boy on the flute is a fright, his face is a horrible sight. When he walks, his knees knock, it creates such a shock, his braces light up in the night. So that opens up that chapter, and then the chapter continues into the prose section by saying Stephen's doctor's appointment was scheduled for 1:15 and his poetry workshop started at 2. The bus ride from Vancouver had taken an extra hour due to bad weather on the Coquihalla. Satisfied yet flustered by his late afternoon bathhouse escapade in Vancouver, he had missed the bus the night before and had to stay in a hotel and catch one early morning. When he arrived, he would still have time for a bagel and some herbal tea before his appointment at the campus clinic just before class. There were 6 remaining manuscript proposals to go over and an exercise on limericks and villanelles to prepare. He could have graded the last half dozen proposals on the bus, but listened to a mixed CD of all female vocalists instead. A homemade collection made by a deceased friend who had hand labeled the tape mostly ladies. Falling asleep halfway between hope and merit, Stephen woke up in time to see the sign advertising the country music capital of BC. On his antiquated portable CD player, Alison Krauss was just finishing up My New Favorite, and Nora Jones followed with Come Away with Me. Then it carries on about the bus ride, and he starts, in his mind, he starts to reprise the opening limerick. He begins to talk about limericks that he's about to teach in a class. And he said, Stephen's high school limerick from more than 4 decades ago had something to do with an unattractive yet musical young man whose face was not a pretty sight. The boy on the flute is a fright. He was required to rhyme the word fright with another word and then make up 3 more lines comprised of 1 original couplet and 1 more rhyming word in the final line that corresponded to the last word of the opening line. His face is a horrible sight. Stephen didn't have a scientific structured brain. He was a Virgo monkey, extremely organized with a foundation of chaos underlying everything he fastidiously attended to. He found himself struggling with strict poetic forms, the seemingly rigid quality of patterned poetry ranging from the villanelle to the sestina always confused him. The limerick was his favorite. He considered it a simple, perfect rhythm for the comic edge that invariably seeped into his poetic voice. When he walks, his knees knock. A precocious wordsmith from an early age, an idiot savant of sorts, Stephen's talent for writing short poems that the teacher often thought he had stolen was quite sophisticated by the time he entered high school. He once wrote a poem about snow for another student, and the teacher refused to accept it, claiming it must have been plagiarized from a poetry book. It creates such a shock. Stephen didn't think it was a great poem himself and had tried to keep it simple for the student he was writing it for, but as it turned out, the student was a strange-looking creature with grimy braces and no mental capacity whatsoever when it came to poetry. So it was a wasted effort and created no small amount of conflict in the schoolyard immediately after English class. His braces light up in the night. You fucking homo, I told you to write something easy for me to understand, like about a snowman or hockey, for fuck's sake. So of course that section I've just read ends with what the young bully had confronted Stephen with as a child, and the rather, abject way of describing a young man in the limerick that was partially given to him. And that is somewhat autobiographical. I do remember writing the end of that limerick. And the actual words were, the girl on the flute is a fright, her face is a horrible sight. I tried to soften the edge gender-wise by saying the boy on the flute is a fright. So that's an example of how the protagonist, based on my time in Kamloops, but somewhat fictionalized, how he uses poetry in the classroom in a variety of ways. In this chapter, I'll finish with a poem that I'd written before, but I've done in a semi-fictional way. I've taken the poem and inserted it into a fictional journey for the protagonist and talk about how he's just written it and he decides not to share this poem with his students in class. And just before the poem, as the bus rolled into Kamloops about an hour after he woke, Stephen put the finishing touches on a poem of historic and culturally astute proportions about a certain vacuum cleaner that revealed his penchant for finding the erotic within humorous semi-autobiographical modes. He goes on for about a paragraph talking about how it's not appropriate perhaps to share that poem in class. And then the poem appears, I don't know if you can see it, the poem appears on the page at the end of the chapter, and it's called, and I'll finish with this, it's just a couple of pages. The poem is called McLuhan's Bride. And this is a very autobiographical poem that I wrote many years ago and include in the book. McLuhan's Bride. Once at a graduate student soiree, the professor's wife told him that McLuhan's bride was afraid of her first vacuum cleaner. He was clearly shaken and hesitated to add that he, on the contrary, felt little techno-based fear when it came to small appliances and all the strained emotional ties they liberate their lovers from, and had in fact experienced a prolonged affair, late 60s, with his mother's first vacuum cleaner, an avocado green Westinghouse, amply accommodating his great pubescent shaft in a most delightful way. Stored in the basement, this mechanical bride, this compact galaxy of carnal pleasure, predating certain groundbreaking post-structuralist thought, stood proud alongside boxes of old clothes, hunting rifles, bewildered World War II Army uniforms, broken rear view mirrors, pocket westerns, and his father's liquor bottles stored in heating ducts. Among the detritus of lives infused with sex and booze, standing squat and satisfied, his thoroughly modern, fully equipped paramour, astute and wild-eyed in her solid ambient purring, giving him uncomplicated joy, strengthening his love for his mother, her taut, brisk arms pulsing strong around her fervent breasts, pressing that small appliance into layers of 1950s synthetic pile, the charged erotic ways of her domestic engineering, reminding him of the ways in which she kept her house in order, providing sons and lovers with the necessary tools to survive in global villages where, as McLuhan once implied, we live centuries in a decade, and telephones remove us from our bodies, inspiring one to think, when you are screwing a vacuum cleaner, you have no conscience, no need of one, save the sudden onset of a short circuit as you engage in one final perfect act of consummate industrial self-indulgence and the grand sweep of oral history that will one day go the way of items stored in a musty basement, works of art, mechanical reproduction, boxes of old clothing, hunting rifles, bewildered World War II Army uniforms, thoroughly modern, fully equipped paramours, canisters astute and wild, having borne silent witness to the grand, eternally pubescent shaft of time. And then the chapter, but it doesn't end with that poem, but the chapter goes on a couple more paragraphs, and then he finally, the crucial part, I'm not really giving anything away because it's fairly obvious, fairly early on, the primary narrative of the protagonist's life is an HIV narrative. So it ends with, the chapter actually ends with a very short limerick that I wrote for the book, and it goes like this. It starts, as he walked toward the classroom, Stephen thought of how often he liked to alter the final rhyme of a limerick in order to punctuate the narrative with a jarring tone, bringing faint chaos and a kind of contradictory, open-ended closure to an otherwise ordered, poetic microcosm. The man with the lisp is afraid. He hides his rage in a cage. As calm as can be, he makes merrily concerning his status regarding HIV. So thank you. That's the reading, and I'll just finish by saying that the poem about McLuhan's Bride, I took an honors course with Donald Thiel, who was a professor at Trent University at the time, and he wrote a book about McLuhan called The Rearview Mirror. And so that's based on the experience of Donald Thiel's wife telling me, probably 40 years ago now, that they knew the McLuhans and when they lived in Toronto and were part of that academic community. And she remembers being told at a cocktail party by McLuhan's wife that she was in fact afraid of her first vacuum cleaner. And that would have been vacuum cleaners for as a kind of, for lack of a less pompous term, a kind of domestic engineering. Would have been very new. So it's a startling thing to hear, but I work it into that poem in a obviously sexualized way that it is fun. I wrote it and read it at a McLuhan conference years ago in Toronto. And it's actually also in an anthology of poetry out of, I forget the name of the university in New York, in Manhattan, but Fordham. It was organized by people at Fordham, and it's a whole collection of McLuhan poetry, and it finds itself in the book as well. So there's another literary intersection or intertextuality for that matter. If it's going to fill a page, I'll throw another poem in. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thank you. It was really wonderful to hear you read this. We still have a few minutes left, and I'd like to give people an opportunity to see a few notes in the chat to ask you questions or talk to you about this, or indeed, because of what we talked at the start, anything around this amorphous thing we call graduate education, because of course this is it's not a singular thing, and there's lots of possibilities there. So as people are thinking about what they may want to ask or throw out there, I just thought I'd make one comment about reliability and irony. And what's when you the first part of your reading, you're talking about you're referencing Thompson Rivers University, and you make this kind of in thing about joking how it's you're referencing Tom Thompson when the university is named after David Thompson, and it's just like a flippant kind of thing to throw off there. But I wonder if you could address perhaps the idea of that almost the tongue-in-cheek quality, and it's what I call double coding. Sometimes you write something for one audience, but someone else is going to read it differently. So I wonder if you could maybe start with that, and then see if there are questions that people want to throw in. And since it's a small group, people can just turn on the mic and say what they want. You don't have to put
sure, yeah. Feel free to come in at any moment if you have a question. I actually, it's interesting. This book I wrote close to 10 years ago on a fellowship, a Chalmers Foundation fellowship available in Ontario through the. So I don't mean to make an excuse, but some of it I don't remember a lot of the motivation around, but I don't think that Thompson Rivers, as you just mentioned, I don't think Thompson Rivers University by name comes up in the narrative. It probably didn't. I think it did in the first writing. Mm-hmm. And we always called it True, which was always interesting to me, because True was also the short version of Truman Capote's name. They always called him True. There's a play called, so so there's all these sort of wordplay intersections that don't always come up in the book. And I say all of that because I don't actually remember thinking of Thompson Rivers University and the name in relation to Tom Thompson at all. Mm-hmm. So like you say, some of these things, they kind of happen through a kind of, a cultural awareness that we're not always completely aware of on the surface when we're writing. So yeah, I'm not. Can you clarify a little bit when you ask me about the irony? And I'm sort of lost.
I guess it wasn't really as much irony as what I said afterwards, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, and it's it's a playfulness, right? So you're right. You don't mention Thompson Rivers University, but anyone who's understanding the context you're talking about will be in that moment of catching themselves, as I do, to saying, wait, it's not named after Tom Thompson, it's named after, oh, I see what you do. Playful, right? It's a Stanley Park kind of phenomena of Streetcar Named Desire.
That I mean, again, sure, we can call it, but that's also an accident, a strange, when I'm writing, sometimes and this is this as my first novel, fairly late in life. It's a new form for me in many ways, even though I've written in this form in much shorter examples. So I'm not always aware of it. I tried to without being too self-effacing, I'm not great at structure. So poems are perfect because it's a short structure. So that I remember I did that classic thing when I was writing it for a year. I just there's pages all over the walls, and there's also some of these connections I wasn't even aware of. And thank you. And now I'm aware of the Tom Thompson one. I don't even remember where Tom Thompson occurs in the book. Does it happen early on? But let's go back to what you just brought up in tongue-in-cheek, that people wouldn't, when you read the novel, that's based on an experience with the show. It was going to Stanley Park in a white stretch limousine when we were picked up, two visiting artists were picked up at the airport. And we had a certain amount of time in the car on the way to where we were going. And I just said, oh, let's drive through Stanley Park. And then I was just being playful, like I often am when I'm at a loss for words. And I said, oh yes, Stanley Park is named after Stanley Kowalski from A Streetcar Named Desire. And for a moment, I think you and our other companion believed me. And I just thought, okay, I did never ever.
I believed. I went, really? And I realized if I say really like that, it usually means you're lying to me, and you were. And it was that moment, right, of play where it, when you're and it's what I'd call like a dry humor, dry wit, where you say something without any expectation that people are going to believe it, but not disbelieve it either. So it's out there and people just nod. It's A
Yeah.
very theatrical, I think, a very theatrical
Well,
moment.
the theatrical part is good to bring up because I was going to say that the Stanley Kowalski, I mentioned it fairly late in the book, I think, but there's a lot of play with Blanche, and Blanche from Streetcar Named Desire is frankly, I mean, I shouldn't say we, but queer culture doesn't own Blanche, but we try hard because Blanche is a kind of a creation by an iconic queer playwright who becomes this touchstone for queer men often, not just queer men, but again, I'm speaking specifically within a particular aspect of a particular identity. And Blanche comes up many times, and Blanche in the 20th century travels from probably before, but my first recognition of the idea of Blanche as a cultural icon starts with Streetcar Named Desire, moves into something so different. And like I've come across much younger queer men who, when you say Blanche, they don't think of Blanche Dubois, they think of Blanche Devereaux in The Golden Girls. And then, of course, in between Blanche Devereaux and The Golden Girls and Blanche Dubois, and the irony is not lost in me when we realize that Blanche Dubois means the White Forest in a certain kind of translation. But then in between Blanche from The Golden Girls and Blanche from Streetcar Named Desire is Blanche Hudson from Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, a very strange and again cult queer. I remember Canadian comic Scott Thompson once from Kids in the Hall being interviewed, and he made the joke that the film Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is the queer man, the gay version of Wonderful Life, because it's such a strange. So it's we look at it was made as a kind of horror movie, but it's become a kind of camp queer classic. So I use all of those things as kinds of intersections into moments of popular culture in different forms of culture. And then, of course, I do remember that moment in Vancouver, and I didn't think it just rolled out. I just suddenly thought, oh yeah, Stanley Park, Stanley Kowalski, Blanche, all that, which is a kind of irreverent but I don't know how reverent we have to be towards someone like Lord Stanley. Not that I know much about him, but we're still trying to unravel that history as we speak. But anyway, so yeah, all of those moments are just, in a way, even though I tried to structure the novel, it's kind of being partly biographical, it almost becomes a stream of consciousness memory. I'm just pouring all of these memories. If I ever try to write another novel, maybe I'll try to write something. I say at the very end in the acknowledgements that I often try very hard to write fiction, and within a few sentences I start talking about myself. So that comes from my history of performance and self-absorption, I suppose, for whatever reason.
I wonder if anyone else has anything they'd like to add or comment or a question. I see there's a bit of chatter in the chat space. Go ahead, Catherine. Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in your inclusion of poetry that you had written at a younger age. I did that in my early 30s when I wrote a dark fantasy hypertext for a company called Eastgate Systems in the mid 90s. And it's been 25 years and I seem to have been rediscovered. And one of the weird things I had not considered when I wrote it, and when I put in the poetry I wrote when I was 15, is that it actually might survive and people might be trying to interpret this text later. And I, had the weird experience of having a middle-aged academic on YouTube trying to interpret poems I wrote when I was 15. Did you, when you include your earlier poetic works, how does that sort itself out, or do you consider in advance what the long-term reception of those poems will be?
That's a great question for me to consider, because I think when I was writing the book, because it is the only long, really fairly long piece of prose I've written. So I don't think I think the poems that are in the book that are from past collections, those collections were only 10 years old at the time when I was writing it. Now they're 20 years old. I don't think I was very consciously thinking about that, and I don't. And the poetry I wrote when I was very young, when I was like the age you mentioned, 15, it doesn't really survive in any. I still have it somewhere, and I don't. And some of it might have been published in my 20s in a school newspaper. But again, not to change the subject so much, but when I think of my older poetry or even newer stuff, I get very concerned. I get very nervous about how people will interpret it, even in the moment, not only regardless of how old, whether it was 20 years ago. And again, it goes back, like I just mentioned very briefly, it goes back to that Truman Capote thing. Early and late in his career, he wrote that book that kind of ruined everything for him socially, because it was so obvious who he was talking about. So I went through, and because it's much of my work is autobiographical or semi-autobiographical, you worry about the perception by the people who might recognize themselves. And I was fairly careful in the book. I think I had in the first really big edit, once it was accepted by the University of Calgary Press, I was told to get rid of 100 pages. So I did. And some of that editing included, okay, maybe I don't need to say that about so-and-so. They might notice. So so I'm changing the subject in a way to another bent, but I take your point, like when we're 15 or even when we're 20 and then we're 60 and then we're like, what we look back at what we meant, whether it's biographical or not, and we think, do we even mean that now? What were we think? Do we even remember what we were thinking at the time? And for someone, like you say, a middle-aged academic, to look back at a 15-year-old's poetry, like who knows what's going to, just to make it more current, what are we going to think? Amanda Gorman's amazing poem that she read at the inauguration, what are we going to think of that in 30 years? And I'm I think it's an amazing poem, and I think it's amazing everything she represented by being there and that poem. I get a little, I shouldn't say surprised, but because I've been part of a poetry world for a long time, there are people, like she's being interviewed by people like James Corden on very popular, and it's like, oh, this is incredible. And it is incredible, but it's not a new form of poetry. It has a very strong base within spoken word and the root and the elements of hip hop that flow into spoken word and all of that stuff. There's a tradition of that, and it's amazing that she was able to bring that to that event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that actually wasn't a change of subject, because the issue of people recognizing themselves was very live. I mean, when I saw that YouTube video, I was realizing that when I published those poems in the mid-90s, it never occurred to me that I would be in social contact with so many people that I went to high school with. So, of course, like, some of the people in those poems, I didn't reference them by name, but if you knew the context, you would know who it was about, are my Facebook friends now. And so, yeah, no, that is very much to the point, the people recognizing themselves as part of that.
Yeah, and that can be kind of scary, right, when you're doing it. And even because I think more often than not, I'm trying to be very sympathetic, and then I read it and I think, oh, whoa, that's not going to. That might be what I'm thinking at the time, but I'm not seeing that when I read it myself, as it becoming the reader of my own work. And so you get nervous about it, and then you decide. And through my whole writing career, in my poetry, I had one poem about my mother's funeral, and I was very nervous at my brother, because my brother, the poem is called "Why Did You Take Me to a Car Wash on the Way to Our Mother's Funeral?" which is what my brother did. And I thought he'd be horrified by it, and he wasn't at all. In fact, all he did, he was amused by it, and all he did was correct it. He said, "Oh, it didn't really happen quite that way." And that wasn't an example of me changing it. It was an example of me remembering it very differently. So sometimes you worry about those things, and they're not a problem at all, and other times you worry about them, and then someone calls you an idiot and says that was really mean, and you think, I didn't mean it that way, but okay. And luckily that hasn't happened to me too much. That's a combination of being careful and also not being published enough. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, I mean, writing, even when it's not biographical or semi-autobiographical, it can be, I love it, but it's also can be it can be very frightening, and it makes you very nervous around. I went through a period of being very nervous because half of this book is based in Kamloops and the other half is based in Toronto. And it's loosely based on the co-op I live in. The co-op is called Margaret Lawrence Co-op, named after, of course, the Canadian author. And the names of the co-op's not in there anymore. And I took it out, and I worried about people recognizing stuff. And no, it's only 2 months old, and I don't know if anyone in the co-op will ever even read the book. But I sometimes get a little nervous about what will they think. What will people think? Like, I kind of characterize an attempted murder in the queer, what we call the queer village, where I live in Toronto. And when I was writing it, I honestly, it hadn't even there. I wasn't aware, and it hadn't come to the point of. I don't know if you're aware of the serial killer in the queer village of a few years ago. He's in prison now, and he killed 5 or 6 queer men. This horrific incident. And so then when I was writing and wrote this thing about an attempted murder, I wasn't thinking of that. I wasn't even aware of it. And then after it happened, I thought, oh, here's someone could read this and think that I'm kind of talking about this horrific event within Toronto's queer village in a playful way in my novel. And that could be considered objectionable. So it's this interesting moment where I didn't even know about it. It hadn't even happened in that way. So you think about that too, but of course, if you think about it too much, you won't write anything. So you just carry on and hope that nobody gets too annoyed with you.
David, thank you for this. Obviously, we're ready at the top of the hour, and I have to close down this somewhat differently framed Dean's Cafe. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for coming here. And of course, if you have anything else you want to chat with me at a different point, you can always reach me. I don't want to preclude the Dean's Cafe as a chance for that, but I did want to do something a bit different here. I thought it was great to have someone like David here who speaks to many of our realities and many of our creative practices within a context of the work we're doing. So I think that was a great start. And this will be recorded, so I'm going to put it up, and people have a chance to hear David's work at a different point, so you can spread that word around. Maybe we could all turn on our mics for just a second and give David a round of applause, and then we can close it. Yay!
Thank you all for coming. Thanks.
That was wonderful.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you so much,
Yes,